Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this evening's live stream presentation here on the Tattooed Historian's Facebook and YouTube channel. My name is John. I am the Tattooed Historian. And this evening, I am so thrilled to be joined by Dr. Tim Cook. Our discussion this evening is called Canada's Second World War Experience and Historical Memory. And we're going to be going over Tim's newest book and some of his other works, public history, and so much more. You never know what direction we're going to go on here, so this is going to be great. But Tim, thank you for being here.
Thanks, John. Great to be on your program, and hello to everyone out there.
Absolutely. For the introduction here, if anyone does not know who Tim is, Dr. Tim Cook is a historian at the Canadian War Museum. He was the curator for the museum's First World War permanent gallery, and he has also curated numerous temporary, traveling, and digital exhibitions. Tim is the author of 13 books, and they have won the CP Stacey Prize for military history twice, the Ottawa Book Award 3 times, the RBC Taylor Prize for literary nonfiction, and the J.W. Dafoe Book Prize twice. His latest book is The Fight for History, 75 Years of Forgetting, Remembering, and Remaking Canada's Second World War, which I have my copy right here, and I'll have a link later for anyone who would like to purchase a copy of this book. In 2012, Tim was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for his contributions to Canadian history, and in 2013, he received the Governor General's History Award. He's a frequent commentator in the media, a member of the Royal Society of Canada, and a member of the Order of Canada. That's a lot of stuff. And I know I didn't touch like that's a very small part of your bio, Tim, but that's fantastic. And I'm so happy to have you on because I was actually introduced to your work probably, about a decade ago or so. I read your 2-part series on Canada in the First World War. And I was like, wow, this is amazing reading. And then you had a 2-part series on the Second World War. And
John, I said I would never write a 2-volume history again back to back after I did those 2 volumes at the Sharp End and Shock Troops. They were my 3rd and 4th books, and there was a kind of shift there, as we were talking a little bit about before. My first 2 books were academic books, and they're still read, but I'm very lucky to work at the War Museum, as you were kind enough to mention there. I see myself as a public historian, and when we opened the museum in 2005, I remember thinking, what do I do now? I mean, we just spent 3 years. It was an incredible journey to be on. Really, I felt quite honored to be the First World War historian. I created the First World War Gallery, as you mentioned. But then it was, where do I go from here? And I had spent all that time thinking about the First World War. And so I wanted to write those 2 volumes. And I wrote them for all Canadians because, I had a feeling at the time that academic historians were really writing for a narrow group themselves for the most part. And being a public historian, I just been a part of this process to open museum, which would be visited by 500,000 people a year. And very clearly, Canadians and Americans and others, we want our history, but often those are producing the history, writing the books, don't do a great job in telling the stories in a way to really connect with readers. And so I set that task for myself, and that sort of put me in a different path. And I've been publishing books since.
That's awesome, Tim. I have to know, though, and a lot of people always want to know this, where did your love of history start? What was the spark that really got you going?
Yeah, great question, John. I'm lucky to have come from a family of historians, both of my parents, PhDs in history. But of course, like most high schoolers, I wasn't much interested in history. It was hockey and rugby and other pursuits. Right. But my parents took me to the Western Front when I was 17, and I remember we had done France, and it was one cathedral after another, and sort of a truculent teenager, not really interested in it. But then we went to Vimy, and we went to the Somme, and we walked those silent cities, those cemeteries where young Canadians and Americans and British lads were buried. And it had an impact on me. I was 17 at the time. I was looking at boys who were buried there who were 16 and who were 15. And I came back with a new appreciation, having walked the battlefields with my dad, with my mother, my brother. I didn't come back and start writing history, but I began to read a little bit more. And I was lucky then to go to Trent University in Peterborough, had wonderful professors there. Again, went not thinking I was going to do history, but I majored in rugby for 2 years and then realized I better do something a little more important. And then, set off on a different trajectory.
It's a little bit easier on the collarbone than rugby.
Yeah, it was. I think some of my old teammates are probably a little surprised where I ended up.
Yeah, you're the second person in like the last 3 interviews who said I wasn't even thinking about history as a major. I was just going to college for something else, or going to university for something else, or had my mind set on maybe pursuing something else, and then I just fell into the historical path.
Yeah, for me it was the writings of starting off with the poetry of the First World War, and then the prose writers, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and there was a connection made there through the powerful eyewitness accounts. And then I moved off into the letters that were written by the soldiers, incredibly powerful and poignant, other times mundane and banal. But if anyone knows my books, I rely really heavily on those eyewitness accounts. I'm a former archivist. I've read tens of thousands of letters. I think it would be fair to say now in a 25-year career, I've spent 25 years interviewing veterans, listening to their stories. And when I write my histories, my 2 volumes that you spoke to, the 2 volumes on the Second World War, my book on Vimy, or Secret History of Soldiers, it is driven by those soldiers. I let them speak. It's not just a series of quotes lined up one after another or anecdotes. There is analysis. I have a PhD in history. I've read most of the books, but it's really important, I think, to try to make these connections with readers. And some of the most gratifying emails and letters I receive come from teachers who say that they use my books to help get young people interested, to help them make those connections. Young people themselves. I had a 10-year-old writing to me for a while. He'd read my 2 volumes on the Second War. There were 1,000 pages. Wow. And I remember thinking, this is fantastic. What a great young guy. And it ranges all the way up to Second World War veterans. I received a letter handwritten from a Second World War veteran, 95 years old, telling me how much he enjoyed reflecting upon his service more than 75 years ago. And he told me as well that he was the last of his comrades who was still alive. Wow. And that struck me, right? We had about 1.1 million Canadians who served in the Second World War in uniform. We're down to fewer than 20,000. And so we're losing this generation, and I wonder where it will take us.
Yeah, I've wondered that too, Tim, because I believe it was last weekend, there was a huge World War II event here in central Pennsylvania that my friends and I have gone to for years. And I remember 20 years ago, they always had a hangar at the airfield where it was full of vets, and you could go in, you could speak to them. They had like a 6 or 8 foot table, and they would sign stuff, and you could converse with them about their service. And I remember it being packed with veterans 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And now there may have been 5 or 6 in there now. And it's like all these oral histories are being lost unless someone was doing the good deeds of writing it down or doing an interview or something like that. And that's the next book, that's the next series of something that could be getting lost.
Yeah, I think you're right, John. And it struck me when I wrote the latest book, the Fight for History. I'd written those 2 volumes you spoke about, The Necessary War, 2014, Fight to the Finish in 2015, and I thought I was done. It was 1,000 pages. It covered just the sweeping campaigns that Canadians fought in, on the oceans around the world, in the air, on multiple continents, fighting in Hong Kong and Dieppe and at Sicily, and through the Italian campaign and the D-Day landings, fighting through Normandy, clearing the Scheldt, the final battles into the Rhineland, the air campaign. I thought I had written it. And when those books came out, as you noted, they won awards, they were bestsellers, but I was traveling the country speaking to Canadians, And they said, thank you for writing this. This is great, but I didn't know these stories. And that struck me, fairly hard. I've devoted 25 years to this, and I'm not a normal person with regards to history. I'm lucky to work at the War Museum. I spend most of my time doing history. But people were saying this, that, they were interested in World War II history, but they read American history or German history or Russian history or the war in the Pacific. And the same thing growing up. They saw the films, American, British, or German films, never about Canada. And I thought, isn't that a bit strange, since Canada really was an epic contribution? As I said, 1.1 million Canadians served, fighting around the world, an important ally, junior ally, but an important ally to the United States and Britain. And yet so few Canadians knew about this. So I wanted to know, why was that? Why had we done such a poor job in this country in telling these stories? And so that's really what the focus of the book is. It looks at that narrative arc and tries to explore how I, growing up in the 80s, could basically be taught almost nothing about the Second World War, and even at university, very little until I really went into senior courses, and I made that conscious decision. And it's a fascinating story. It's a bit of a sad story because it's really a self-inflicted wound. But the good news is, in more recent years, things have improved. Canadians have done a better job in telling these stories, paying attention. But as you have said, done so while the veterans, the last of them, are passing away. I mean, average age of 95, the next 5, 6, 7 years, we will lose most of them, except for a few outliers, I think.
Mm-hmm. Do you think for some, before we dive deep in the book here, do you think for some, because they're coming around to understanding Canada in the Second World War now, or trying to, at least, and trying to embrace it, do you think too many Canadians are now like, oh, I wish I would have talked to my grandfather about this before he passed, and now I lost that? Or do you think maybe they're going to dig a little bit harder into their family history now due to books such as yours, because social memory is constantly changing?
It is, yeah. It's a good point, John. It's always shifting. It's always taking on new meaning with each generation. That's the nature of my book, is to look at the layering of the history. But you hit it directly. I mean, I've had a lot of Canadians come up to me and thank me, book signings. I really appreciate what you've done here. I have a better sense of what my dad did, or my great uncle, or my brother, or whatever it is. But they also almost always say, I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I'd had the grammar or the language to speak to them. I wish, people often say, that my dad or my great uncle had been able to talk about it, because I think we now have a much greater sense of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, or just the challenges of service personnel when they come back to tell their story. And that's a part of my book as well. That it hasn't always been easy for veterans, in the case of this book, the Second World War generation, but I've been lucky to speak to Korean War veterans and peacekeeping veterans and veterans of the Canadian Forces and Afghanistan veterans. It's never been easy for veterans to talk about their story. It takes time, and that's a part of my book as well.
Mm-hmm. That's almost a universal thing, where a lot of vets, or they quote know who they want to talk to about it, and they know who they don't want to talk to about it, or are comfortable with speaking with someone, and maybe not someone else. You talk about the complicated, contested, ever-shifting meaning of the Second World War for Canadians, and whether they were veterans or civilians. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that, Tim?
Well, contested insofar as that there's a struggle over history, and the title of the book matters, right? The fight for history. I see history as a fight, as a struggle, as a clash, that there are always differing groups and differing opinions, and that's good. We have these fierce debates. What's not good is silence. What is not good is apathy. What is not good is the failure to tell your story, or even to make the effort. And that's what I found. The book, it's, the subtitle is forgetting. It starts with the forgetting. And Canadians forgot their contributions very quickly. We've talked about the 1.1 million Canadians. One of the things that happened in Canada, like the GI Bill in the US, is that the state treated veterans fairly well, much better than First World War veterans. Canadian veterans came back. The economy was booming. There was trade with the United States through wartime industry. The state gave training to veterans to put them in jobs. There were land grants. About 45,000 went to university. Significant changes in Canadian society emerged from the Second World War, the birth of the welfare state and other aspects. So the veterans were treated well. They went into jobs. In Canada, there was this massive baby boom, all these babies born. My parents are from that. And the country changes. What we weren't doing was looking backwards. We're looking forwards into the prosperous 20th century. And by not looking backwards, we didn't write the proper histories, as I talk about in the book. We didn't create television shows or films. And maybe most importantly, we didn't create separate memorials. And so as the generation of veterans moved forward, as the new generation came in the 50s and 60s, they had no connection to the war. And of course, it was in the middle of the Cold War. In the 60s, you have the rise of youth power in Vietnam, other things like that. And the war was left behind. And I think the book, it's never easy, John, to try to explore why an event doesn't happen. It's a lot easier to try to track the intellectual history of, A connects to B to C, and that's how we get here. Right. I was looking at and thinking, isn't it weird that the Second World War is just not represented in Canadian culture or politics or film or books? And I thought the absence is very strange. So how do you explore an absence? How do you explore and give voice to a silence? And I think I have in this book. I've found unconventional sources, Legion magazines, and sometimes the popular press and speeches and veterans themselves. But it's an interesting story of how quickly Canada pushed the war aside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you pointed something out in the book that I really want to touch on, and from someone who's visited usually every summer when we don't have a pandemic going on. Was the fact that every little town that I went through had a cenotaph for the Great War. And it almost seemed like that was where your eyes were drawn to as far as historical memory. And then if you went maybe around the back, it was Second World War additional, or an addition put on the back of it, whether it be actually engraved in it or a tablet that's been bolted to the cenotaph. And that's something I was really interested in before I cracked into your book, was the memorialization, because for Americans, we're having this big thing with memorials now and monuments. And I didn't put two and two together until I read your book about how sometimes the Second World War was, many Canadians didn't know how they wanted to do it because of the cenotaphs were one way, but then living memorials were another. And that was something totally new to me.
Yeah, thanks. John, I think it's an interesting part to the book, because I'm really a scholar and historian of the two world wars. And, I've written many books on the First World War, including my book on Vimy in 2017. And that really tried to look at why Vimy was such a powerful martial symbol in Canada, right? It's on our $20 bill. It's in our passport. It's taught in all the schools. There were even hats, saying the birth of the nation. That's a phrase you often hear among some groups in Canada. And the idea that Vimy really propelled us forward. And for your watchers here, Vimy was that 4-day battle from the 9th to the 12th of April, 1917, when the Canadian Corps, 4 divisions strong, surged up the ridge, which the Germans had held really from almost the start of the war, and drove them back. And it's become, a really powerful legend in Canada, a bit like I suspect Gettysburg is in the United States, or we know Gallipoli in Australia, that, countries, they pick battles, and these battles become symbols for other things. Think of the Russians with Stalingrad. It's a little more difficult for the French to find successful battles in the 20th century, but, Verdun sometimes is there. So Canada's Vimy. And really, Vimy writ large, it's the First World War. This is seen as a really defining moment in Canada. Canada confederated in 1867. So 50 years later, we have the First World War, this titanic, traumatic event in our history. A country of 8 million, 1 in 3 adult males is serving, 66,000 were killed. That's a staggering number, and it really transforms Canada. And it's very clear that the First World War is seen as something where the country is forever changed, nearly torn apart through conscription. But, John, it didn't leave a lot of space to talk about the Second World War in that way, right? What is the Second World War? If you've been born 50 years, if you've been born in the First World War, you can't be born twice. Now, there's lots of legacies from the Second World War, but one of the challenges is the memorialization. As you talked about, we built thousands of memorials across the country. Every city, every town, every village, there was a memorial, partially because of the terrible trauma of those losses. And they were in public places of prominence, as you mentioned. And then in 1945, as this new generation of veterans came back, there was a real question, and I talk about this in the book. What would we do? Would they build 4,000 more memorials? And of course, people said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, we have this memorial. Can't we just add the names of the fallen from the Second World War to it? And that's ultimately what many communities do. And instead, as you alluded to, they created these functional memorials. They created libraries and gardens and hockey arenas and swimming pools. And these were sites of living energy and places in the community, and they often called them a commemorative center or something along those lines. But the Legion, the largest body of organized veterans, said, yeah, it's good to build a library, but it's not a sacred space. It's not a place where people will bear witness and come together. And they were right. A hockey arena is a good thing for the community, but it's not a sacred area. Right. And so by not having those different memorials in the communities, I argue that the Great War continued to have a dominating space. And in the book, I also look at how veterans coming back accepted things like Remembrance Day, and they accepted the poppy as emblems of remembrance. But the one thing they wanted was a new national memorial in downtown Ottawa. Our national memorial was built in 1939. And then these veterans come back and say it's too closely linked to the First World War. Again, that idea of the dominance of the First World War, the Great War. And the government of the day denied them this. And I've really uncovered this story. And I argue in the book, if there had been a separate World War II memorial, I think it would have had a stronger place. There would have been an anchor there in the memorial landscape for other generations. That didn't happen. And I argue to the detriment of the really kind of understanding of Canada's contributions during World War II.
It's amazing how much the Great War still impacts how we see Canada from the United States perspective, because when I told people in my grad school that I wanted to go study the First World War, they're like, well, go to England or Canada.
Right.
And that was the thing. And I was still like, well, if you want to study World War II, go to Canada. It was, you want to study the Great War, go to Canada. Yeah. So it's still kind of that way, right? Where people just automatically, especially with the poppy, like you say, and stuff like that, it still harkens back to First World War. And then when I would speak to some of my friends about Canadian involvement in Second World War, it immediately goes to Dieppe. Or it goes to some other kind of thing that went horribly wrong. Yeah. And it's like, why aren't we looking at what positive, if you will, things occurred at that time where it was a victory or it was something else? It's not glorification, but it's like you can't always look towards the terrible things that occurred.
Yeah, you're exactly right, John. And even if we were to take those two events, because Dieppe was the main battle that Canadians knew, and I think everyone else, Americans and British as well. Vimy, a clear-cut victory, where our national memorial is today, still in France, still bearing witness to the contributions, the service and sacrifice. And Dieppe, a horrible slaughter on one day in the war that went terribly wrong. why not the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War? I mean, 100,000 Canadians served in the Royal Canadian Navy, 12,000 served in the Merchant Navy. This is the vital lifeline to Britain, to keep Britain in the war. American and Canadian war supplies sent across the Atlantic. Nobody talks about it. Why not the 100,000 Canadians who served in the Italian campaign in a series of really important and victorious battles? Nothing. D-Day, I think many Canadians know that the 3rd Canadian Division landed on D-Day, and I know your Project 44 guys have been doing some great discussions there, but not the Scheldt campaign. Probably the most important contributions of the Canadians in October, November of 1944, clearing the Scheldt region, absolutely crucial to keep the logistics flowing for the Allied forces, completely unknown. And so the battles, again, to come back to the earlier conversation, the battles you choose tell you something about the social memory. And in the book, I look at the strange hold that Dieppe had on Canadians and others as well, really to the detriment of understanding the larger contribution of the war effort. Mm-hmm. And there are reasons for that. Dieppe was a horrible mistake. There's always been a conspiracy element to it because records were either destroyed or not created. Mountbatten's involvement, the idea that, the losses there contributed to the D-Day landings and the success. There's all kinds of stuff there. But again, it was around defeat. And as I write in the book, by the early 1990s, that's what Canadians knew about the war effort. The Canadian war effort was one of defeat and disgrace. And I write in the book, there was no other country in the world that turned the victory around and made it into this very strange defeat that it was not. Mm-hmm. And that too compelled me. And there was a really important film that came out in 1992 called The Valor and the Horror, a 3-part film where veterans for decades had been saying, you have to do a better job to the state. CBC is our major broadcaster. You've got to do it. You got to tell our story. Where are the documentaries? And then when finally the NFB, the National Film Board, and the CBC finally make a film, it reinforces this idea of defeat and disgrace. And to the point where they picked one battle in Normandy, and the one they chose is the Battle of Verrières Ridge, which some of your watchers will know was a clear-cut Canadian defeat on the 25th of July. But it's the only real defeat in this campaign that involves the D-Day landings and holding off the 12th SS Panzer attacks, and then slowly moving forward in the capture of Caen with the British, and the defeat there at Verrières Ridge. But then moving forward, and ultimately, if you had seen this film, you would have thought that the Allies lost the Battle of Normandy, which we know they didn't. So it hit a low point in the early 90s, an absolute disaster in my mind.
Is there a clear-cut difference in how it's perceived from just after the war, let's say, if, during the baby boom years, like, let's say 1945, 1950, for example, and then how it's seen in the 1960s during the Vietnam era? Because we see that in the United States, where we see the anti-war or the cost of war thing pop up a lot more when there's another conflict going on. And Canada obviously goes into the Cold War along with the rest of us against the Soviet Union. Is there a shift in that way, or is it kind of consistent throughout these periods? Because you talk about how when you were a kid, it still wasn't being discussed.
Yeah, it's a good question, John. And I think, in the immediate post-war years, 1945, 46, 47, a number of journalistic histories came out. They were bestsellers. And so people wanted this. And the only real histories produced were by the Army, the official histories, and they're very good, by Colonel C.P. Stacey. And yet they were not bestsellers in any sense, and Canadians were getting their history in other places. And then, as I argue, because of so within maybe 4 or 5 years, we move forward. We're in the Cold War. We're in a period of great prosperity in Canada, where there's the Korean War from 1950 to 53, where about 27,000 Canadians served, but it was largely forgotten. And we move forward into the 50s and 60s, and the same thing happens in Canada, where there is a real strong anti-war movement, and And veterans and members of the Canadian Forces have told me in the late 60s they couldn't walk outside in a uniform without being, verbally assaulted, I suppose. And so without the memorials and the history and the films and the documentaries, there was nothing to hold on to, is I guess what I'm arguing. So then by the next generation, the 60s and 70s, it's really adrift. It's unmoored. And that continues up until the 90s, that real low point. And then it surprisingly changed, and it changed with the 50th anniversary. And that was really important in 1994 and 95, important for the United States as well to re-engage with its World War II history, key events, celebrations, commemorations. Thousands of Canadian veterans went back on their own dime because they would have been in their early 70s at this point, and they were greeted as liberators. There were thousands of cheering French citizens, and the next year in the Netherlands, the Dutch, who had never forgotten, huge parades. And this was all broadcast live in Canada. And it was a sea change because Canadians, two things, they kind of woke up and realized, who are these veterans, right? We have veterans? How strange. I thought we were a nation of peacekeepers. Of course, we have a proud peacekeeping tradition, but we fought a lot of war in our history. And our whole country has been defined by war. If you think of the 17th and 18th century as well, and 6 wars in the 20th century, 10 years in Afghanistan. So we're not a country that has not been without war. But I argue from those key anniversaries in 1995, Canadians woke up to this. And there's also a bit of a sense of shame, I think, that we had done such a poor job in telling our history. We had allowed the bonds of the past to erode. Canada was going through a gut-wrenching crisis with Quebec, which was trying to succeed and almost breaking up the country in 1995. And from that point forward, I argue Canadians have done a better job in thinking about their history and telling the history, in allowing veterans to speak. The Juno Beach Center, which is now at Juno Beach in Normandy, there was nothing there. It took veterans to raise that money, and they finally built it in 2003. A shocking absence, I argue, in the book. And now that has become a much more prominent site of commemoration for Canadians. And I think for others, Americans and British and the French, to realize that Canadians bled for the victory as well.
That's an amazing point, Tim, because I follow the Juno Center on Twitter and other socials. I follow the Canadian War Museum. Obviously, I've visited several times Canadian War Museum, as we spoke about when we were offline. I've yet to get to the Juno Beach Center, but I'm sure that'll happen sooner or later. But seeing those as not only places of educational opportunities, but almost as memorials themselves has been really interesting to me as well, because I remember walking into the Canadian War Museum and being like, Canada's been involved in all this. And then I walked out being like, well, they kicked our butts twice for the Americans. That's something I got to take home with me. Yeah. But seeing that as almost living memorial landscapes too can make an effect on a population, and you probably see that a lot at the War Museum.
Yeah, I'm really lucky, John, to be there, and it had been now 20 years. And before that, there was a war museum that opened in 1942 in Ottawa, but it was a tiny little museum. And I grew up in Ottawa, and I used to go every year, and I loved it, but nothing ever changed. And it was not up to museological standards as they had evolved over the 20th century. And as I recount in the book, again, it was veterans who fought for a new Canadian War Museum. A number of prominent Second World War veterans and others from the Cold War who really came together. And this is what emerges out of those 1995 anniversaries, where Canadians woke up to these veterans. We realized they were passing away in larger numbers. Their children of the 1960s and 70s who had also passed through and were aging, I think, with a better sense of their own family history, with a better sense of the country's history. And politicians as well, understanding that we had done a very poor job. And so the War Museum, I was lucky to be a part of that, opened in 2005, May 8th, 2005. And it's been a stunning success, about 500,000 visitors a year. It's in downtown Ottawa, so it's really one of the main national museums. I always feel a great sense of pride being there, meeting visitors, touring through people, doing exhibitions. I've done about a dozen exhibitions. And, we've been talking, John, you're a public historian. I'm a public historian. I believe Canadians want their history. It's evident at the War Museum. People pay money to come and to learn and to understand and to be moved. And it's the stories we tell there are utterly powerful. They're evocative. I see people brought to tears. I see them doing all the things, looking at artifacts, having those intergenerational conversations, young school kids going through. We're not just a museum, I think, of education. We are a museum that really seems to resonate with people. And I would argue the War Museum is absolutely crucial to understanding the change among Canadians in having a better understanding of our complicated and contested, to come back to your original question, history. It's not always, it's not patriotic, hand on your heart, stand behind the flag history. We engage with difficult discussions. We talk about infringements on civil liberties. We talk about death and brutality in war. We talk about loss and grief. And yet, as you said as well, it's not just the bad. It's history, warts and all, but not just the warts. There are stories of great heroics and courage. There are stories of Canadians coming together and being pushed to the limit. There are stories of what happens when they break down from battle stress or shell shock, but also when they push forward and achieve objectives in war on the home front that no one thought was possible. And ultimately, we look at how war has shaped this country. And you just can't understand Canadian history, just like American history, unless you understand the role of Indigenous people in warfare, the colonial, the European contact wars, and how that shaped this country. The wars of empire, 1763, we became a British nation. Think about the American Revolution and sending loyalists north to change the fabric of Canada again, injecting thousands of English Canadians and Black Canadians. The War of 1812, where if defeat had occurred at the hands of the Americans, we would be American. The 19th century, a period of great turmoil and strife. And as I argue sometimes, if it hadn't been for the American Civil War, it looked very clear that the Americans with manifest destiny were moving across the continent and were looking to go north. And to think about the 20th century, Canada fought 6 wars, and of course, Afghanistan. And so, it would be wrong to say the only way to understand Canadian history is through military history. But it would certainly be wrong to say you don't need to know anything about it, because no, it's a key part of what it means to be Canada and the contemporary Canada that we live in today.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And it's not just because you're here, Tim, but I've told people for years that the War Museum is my favorite museum because it challenges you to think deeper about things. It's not this hurrah, over the top kind of thing. It's something that has, like you say, it has the good, the bad, and the ugly to it, because history is full of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there are times when you're going to be uncomfortable, and that's okay.
Yeah.
It's a great way to grow as a person. And Tyler is in the comments, and he has an interesting question. Was there less commemoration of World War II because World War I is seen as their dad's, and he goes on war, and they felt guilt to commemorate the Second World War? Was it almost seen as like the Great War? I guess what he's saying is it almost seen as like untouchable. We'll stick with that, and that's about it. Yeah,
good question, Tyler. And yeah, I think just the dark shadow of the Great War really is cast deep across the country. And within veterans organizations, there's a really interesting struggle, which is similar in American veterans organizations as well. But when the Canadian Legion is established in 1925 from a number of different veterans groups, and it becomes the most prominent veterans group. Well, all the leadership positions are filled by World War I guys, and then their sons come back, and there's quite a lot of strife there over traditions, and the guys in the trenches saying, "You didn't fight a real war," we were on the Somme and Passchendaele, and so that kind of intergenerational conflict, it took a while to sort out as well. And I've spoken to veterans, and my book looks at that and tries to explore that. So I do think that there's an element there. I think ultimately veterans from the two world wars, they do begin to coalesce in the 60s, because they realize in that decade we've been talking about that Canadians writ large have just tuned out, that they don't care anymore about either war. And that's difficult for most of the veterans to take, because of course those involved in veterans organizations feel a very powerful impulse both to care for their living comrades, but those who fell in war, that real sense of we should not forget them lest we forget. And I talk about in the book, by the late 60s, Remembrance Day in Canada, so November 11th, which is now a really prominent day. One of the newspapers I quote from called it a day of indifference, that Canadians simply did not care. They weren't coming out anymore. And that continues into the 70s and 80s. And that's part of that larger forgetting, I think.
The one thing also that I think a lot of people don't realize is how much in popular culture Canadians are somewhat forgotten. And I'm wearing a Dam Busters shirt, and the Dam Busters movie cuts the Canadians out of it.
Yeah,
and they're all British. All of a sudden, they're not Canadians.
Yeah,
I believe The Great Escape is another one where you see Canadians had involvement in that. We don't see that. How about that is concerning to historical memory, social memory, and stuff like that? Because it's almost like you said earlier, you may not be seeing it in class, but then you go to the movie theater, and it's just like everyone is either British or American or German, and maybe French, but for Second World War sometimes not.
Yeah,
and Canadians are just kind of thrown off to the side, sadly, because of that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I talk about that in the book. The irony that during the war itself, Canada had a very robust filmmaking industry through the National Film Board, producing hundreds of films that both explained the war to Canadians, but also portrayed Canadians to the world, including the D-Day landings, the footage there, the scoop. My wife, Sarah, has researched that. And, the tremendous, visual, I think you can probably picture it, the Canadians landing, and they're coming out of the landing craft. That's some of the most powerful footage out there. And yet after the war, because we failed to tell our story, it is diminished and then forgotten. And even in those great blockbuster films, and in the book, I love The Great Escape and I love The Longest Day. Those are movies I watched. But again, as you said, the Canadians were written out, and I talk about that. And I talk even about a sad story in 1962 when The Longest Day comes out, and the Queen's Own Rifles, a Toronto regiment that landed on D-Day, one of the spearhead formations. They go out, they march down to the theater. There's bands, there's speeches, and they go in to see this movie, and there's almost nothing on Canada, and they emerge almost in tears. And the reviews for that I write about in the book. The journalists of the day are kind of lamenting it, and they're saying it's a really good film, folks, as it is. It's a classic, as we know, but Canadians will be disappointed. And I continue that forward to Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers. And I'm not naive enough to say, oh, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, you need to include the Canadians in your documentary, right? No, they're making a Hollywood film, and very successfully, or a series in the terms of Band of Brothers, and all the power to them, because those two productions alone, we know, have a tremendous impact on people around the world in re-engaging with World War II to better understand it. And yet, the larger point is that Canada is really not represented. And And I say in the book, we don't have a Spielberg in Canada, and it's not easy to make films in Canada. 38 million Canadians, different scale of economy, and all that, and yet we have never tried very hard. And that one of the interesting things, John, about my book is it's resonated with a lot of people. I've had a lot of people write to me, say, how do we do it? How do we make a film? And will you write the script? And, this is great, guys. But I'm a historian and I'm a curator, but I'm not a filmmaker. And one of the things that we try to do, John, with your show and me with my books and exhibitions is I want to create the knowledge. I want to put it out there for people, but it's other people then maybe to take it and run with it to the next product or the next thing, a social media or a podcast or just a great website, something for school kids, for teachers, for curators and archivists, and possibly someday a major documentary. I mean, we need that in Canada. It's not too late. And I firmly believe Canadians want that as well. So, we talked a little bit, John, and at the end of the book, I sort of write about the challenges of doing history and that sometimes it can be lonely work and often you can't make a living out of this. But it's important work, it's important because these are important stories. And if you don't tell your own story, don't expect anyone else to do it for you. Right. And a lot of the forgetting in my book, these are self-inflicted wounds. And a lot of the remaking, which is the last part of the subtitle, the remaking is from individual Canadians who have said, we're going to tell the story. We're going to do the hard work. We're going to explore our family history. We're going to do that genealogy. We're going to go explore the letters that are in the attic. I'm going to try to find out what this medal means. I'm going to go to the War Museum. I'm going to go to the Juno Beach Center. I'm going to watch this documentary. I mean, all of these things, it is a collective. And without getting too preachy, I do think it's important. I think it's important to know our history, to understand where we come from and how we got here. And then if my book has taught me anything, is to think about what's the next generation going to learn.
Mm-hmm. I think, I think good historians are great enablers. And we like to light the fuse and be like, okay, go find out more or whatever. And allowing for accessibility to the narrative is huge. And I think that a lot of us understand that when we go into history, it's almost like you're going to have a vow of poverty for a while. Yeah. But it's those messages that you get from people like you talked about at the beginning, where people are like, well, I didn't know this, or you've inspired me to go this route in life. The Canadian War Museum inspired me to go back, get my public history degree, and so on and so forth, because that's personal for me. And I know it's personal for other people. Or I didn't know my grandfather did this. I didn't know my grandmother was a CWAC. That is really more gratification than, a $1 million contract to write a screenplay or something like that. Although that'd be nice.
It wouldn't be bad, right?
I'm available, Tom Hanks, but
But John, I think you've hit on something important there. It's family history, isn't it? It's we all have family history. We don't all have someone who served in the war. I had a grandfather who flew in Bomber Command, so that was always an area of interest for me. But I had another grandfather who was a pacifist, and that too has interested me. It wasn't easy to be a pacifist during the Second World War in any country. Yeah. And, I didn't have anybody who served in my direct family in the First World War, although my wife had a descendant who was killed, and we visited the battlefields. We saw his name on the Menin Gate. That was a very powerful experience, just to be a part of that visceral feeling. And I think, as I have been doing public history for 25 years now, that there really are many ways for us to connect. Often it comes through formal schooling, for good or for ill. But I think we all remember one of those history teachers who, was just a cut above, right? Who could just fire you up with amazing stories and ways to engage with the past. And then there's all the other things in our lives that help to connect us. And I see more and more family being one of those people wanting to know their roots, Now, frankly, a 24-year-old who's just come out of university and an engineering degree, that's probably not the first thing on their minds. But that's okay. You come to the War Museum, you learn something, you watch the film, you listen to this podcast, and it's cumulative. It builds over time. And when we do have those slow moments in our life, and they're fewer and fewer these days, maybe there are opportunities there to talk to your elders, to look through those letters, to think about it. And it doesn't always have to be someone who served in uniform. I mean, anybody who lived through the Second World War was affected by it, or other time periods. And I do think a family history is a way for us, and often a motivator for us to find out more.
Yeah, and even amongst veterans, I found that some of them are like, "Oh, I only was in the quartermaster. I wasn't on the front line." It's like, but that's still important. And we see that with people who didn't serve, where they're like, "Oh, I didn't serve in World War II, so I have little knowledge or whatever," but they have a living experience of it, which is still an important story. And
it is. In my books, I've interviewed veterans for a long time, and at the War Museum, we have an official program to interview and capture these oral histories, because, as we said, we're losing them, and if you're never going to get them back, and we're losing veterans every single day from the World Wars, from Korea, from early Cold War. There are Afghanistan veterans in Canada who went on the first tour in 2001 or 2002 who could be 50 years old now, or older. And so that's, we need to keep this in mind, that history is a precious resource, and once it's gone, it's gone. That lived history. And I do think it's something we need to work at. And that too is a part of the book and the title, The Fight. Yeah. The fight is the interpretations. Thank you. There you go. It's the fight against apathy, and it's the fight against forgetting, and it's the fight against waiting too long to do the things we want to do and ask the questions that we need to ask.
Yeah, and some of us have been guilty of that when we have a grandparent who tells us things when we're an 8-year-old and we can't understand it. And then we're like, I wish I had that grandparent back to tell me all that, because now I understand it, or now I appreciate it. Yeah. I've personally been involved in that. Neil, thank you for being on. There you go, Tim. Tim makes me a better Canadian. My best to you both.
Well, there's Neil Orford. He's a terrific guy.
He is.
A former teacher, a gifted Canadian, who has really made it his mission, and a shout out to all the teachers out there to share these important stories. Neil talked me into giving a lecture to his high school at one point, and I enjoyed that. And it takes champions. History takes champions. Neil and his group, Defining Moments, have done a great job in finding a way to connect with people, to tell those stories, to show those photographs. John, you and I, we deal with history all the time, but for some people, just to see a historic photograph from 100 years ago, that's an amazing thing, right? I mean, to think this thing is 100 years old, from the First World War, or, this uniform from the Fenian raids of 1866. I mean, whoa, that blows my mind. How did it survive? Why did it survive? What's the story here? How many generations of people had to care for those objects, and to make it to a museum, or to still be in your attic, or to not have the moths eat away at it? And sometimes I find that amazing, and I love working at the War Museum and seeing the objects. There's nothing quite like being able to pick up a Bren gun, or to see a real Victoria Cross. We don't touch them, but to have a Victoria Cross a foot away from you, to read the letters of a soldier from Normandy writing home, and they stop on the 8th of August, 1944, and you go, oh, darn. And you realize he was killed that day. This is the stuff of history. It's very powerful.
Rob McGuire has a question, but I want to piggyback off that real quick with you, Tim. You write, and towards the end of the book, you write, history can be dangerous Governments are often afraid of it and the passions that it stirs up. Politicians prefer heritage, a much more anodyne reading of what came before and more celebratory than critical. And you go on to say, it is the professional historians who tend to do the heavy lifting in the archives to reclaim what has been forgotten, even if they're narrowly specialized and little read articles and scholarly books rarely reach the general public. And I really think that, you have experience in the archives, I have experience in the archives. So many archivists do thankless work, or they're not thanked enough in the books that they help create. They know they help create it, but the public doesn't understand that they help create it. And sometimes the authors forget too. And I'm so glad that with your experience as an archivist and mine, we know that the people in the dark recesses of the archives are doing so much good work out there, and you see it at the Canadian War Museum a lot.
Yeah, very lucky, and I love to spend time in the archives. It's where the discoveries happen. There's nothing quite like reading through an operational report from 77 years ago, and looking at that photograph or a work of art. It's really powerful, and it is those archivists. I'm a former archivist. My wife's an archivist, and we're a bit of a house of history. My dad was an archivist, but it really is. And and I'm glad you read that paragraph, because it keeps going, and it talks about the impact of archivists and curators and teachers and genealogists and filmmakers, and it's sort of it takes a lot of people to keep our history alive, to keep it going, to make sure these stories don't disappear. And I've always felt these are important aspects. And to maybe come back to the initial statement you had made, that often governments are afraid. The state is afraid of what will be revealed. And I have always been maybe naive about this, but I say, we need to tell the truth. We need to present it as it was. I don't want to create a militaristic view of the world wars. No, these were young men and sometimes women, ordinary, coming from farms and factories, communities across the country, put into harm's way, undergoing stress and strain we could never possibly know, suffering through fear and exhaustion and deprivation, and yet more often than not finding ways to keep moving forward. And that has always amazed me. And we need to tell these stories in all of their brutality and heroics. And I hope others agree with that, that this is part of it. It's part of that constant reevaluation.
Right. Rob, I'm going to get to your question now, so thank you so much. Rob, from my friend in Canada as well. Quick question. I just had a look at the picture on the cover of Dr. Cook's book. I had no idea that Canada had commandos. Can you please comment on the Canadian commandos?
Yeah. It's a bit of an odd photograph. It's a beach. Well, there you go. Yeah. It's Royal Canadian Navy Beach Commando. And it's experts like you can pick that up. And we had a parachute battalion in the war, various one thinks of maybe First Special Service Force, the Devil's Brigade, which was an interesting unit. But this is a photograph from Normandy in the early days, and part of that beach commando force. And one of the things that always strikes me as interesting, I've just curated an exhibition at the War Museum called Forever Changed. It looks at the many stories of individual Canadians, just how many units there were. We often think of Army, Navy, Air Force, but then you think Air Force, you have fighters and you have bombers and you have Coastal Command, you have Transport Command, and then you have ground crews. And you keep going. And I think I saw at one point, there's over 2,000 individual Canadian units during the war. As John said, in logistics and in transport and in all aspects of from the sharp end all the way back. And I think that's really interesting that we often, and maybe I'm guilty of this, focus on combat units, but there's no combat unless you get the shells there or the bullets and you get the wounded off the battlefield and that kind of thing. So I might be a little more attuned to that because, John, I'm working on a new book on war and medicine in the First World War and the idea of force protection, and we're all coming through and have survived this, hopefully, this terrible pandemic, and thinking about a major health crisis and how that impacts public health afterwards. And, in the First World War, incredible evolutions and revolutions in medical care. But half of all Canadian doctors served overseas, and a third of nurses, they come back, and then they go back into the public healthcare system, which is forever changed by the war. So these fascinating stories, they never stop for me, continue to interest me, and hopefully the book buying public.
Yeah, well, I hope when you complete that one, you'll come back on the live stream and chat.
September of 22.
All right. Well, I'll probably still be going with what I do. But everyone, I did put a link in the comment section on both YouTube and Facebook for Tim's new book, The Fight for History. You're definitely going to want to pick this one up. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And as someone who, as I said before, has seen Canada as his second home, it's good to find out more about what families of my friends who are there have gone through. And it's been great to showcase Canadians this week for Normandy Week, because we're often inundated with American or British. It's time to give Canada some props here. And Tim, thank you so much for being on. I really do appreciate your time, and I can't wait for book number 14 to come out.
Thanks, John. Appreciate that. Thanks so much for doing what you're doing, and thank you, everyone out there for watching. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for watching on Facebook and YouTube. Again, the link is in the chat. Please go get your copy of Tim's new book. Be safe out there. I will chat with all of you very, very soon. Take care, everyone.